Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. Now, Mr. Rose Riggins here is here for a wonderful presentation. So please join him in learning about racial equity.
Bless you, Miss Jessica. Look, one last little quick note. Y'all know how we roll. Beautiful. I'm going to come back to the chat. Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing? I wish I could see all of your beautiful faces. I wish I could hug your beautiful necks as well, but I know that we're still in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be back with so many of you again. I know it's been quite a moment since some of us have connected, but it's wonderful that we're still able to maintain our relationships and, more importantly, maintain our connections, even if it's in the virtual space. So I'm definitely grateful. I'm definitely humbled to be here. I do wish our time together to be as interactive as possible. I recognize that there may be some limitations and restrictions to that, but y'all know how we do it. We make the most of it regardless of the situation and regardless of the context. Once again, thank you, Miss Jessica. Thank you all so much for inviting me into the space. Thank you so much for inviting me to join the conversations as well. Anytime I have the privilege of engaging in conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even racial equity, I never remove myself from the conversation. I always leave the space in a much different place. I learn so much from each of you each time I have the opportunity to engage in these conversations as well. And into the space. So let's open the space by lifting up an opening video that's entitled Lead with Love. They give me control of this computer, y'all. They never know what we're gonna get. So once again, welcome to our conversation on advancing racial equity and home visiting, recognizing that advancing racial equity goes beyond home visiting services because it applies to every single aspect of our systems as well as our services, policies, practices. I love how it always wants to start. I hope that you were able to hear the sound. I didn't do a sound test. Were you able to hear the sound?
Yes, we could. It was great.
Okay, perfectly. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So here are some of the conversations I'm hoping that we will have an opportunity to engage in this afternoon. We know that a part of advancing racial equity is to be more aware of my own personal values, beliefs, and even biases. So we're going to spend some time exploring some activities to uncover some of our implicit biases that may be influencing some of the inequities that we may be seeing in our systems, and some of the inequities that we may even be seeing in our communities. So we're going to lift some of those activities to uncover some of our implicit biases, as well as disrupt them and transform them. We're going to think about some of the key attitude, knowledge, and skills, and organizational culture and mindsets that may be necessary to work cross-culturally and to support culturally centered work with children and families. And ultimately, we're going to discover a plethora of resources to advance equity in all of our work, all of our personal and professional practices to support diverse children, families, and communities. Let's open the space again by thinking about some of the inequities that may exist, particularly in healthcare. So before you see various statements that are posted, I'm going to invite you to consider whether these statements are indeed myths or are these statements facts. So the first statement reads that equity in care for women during pregnancy varies drastically across racial and socioeconomic status due to ongoing systemic racism and other social injustices that impact women. Is that statement a myth or a fact? Feel free to unmute and feel free to lift your response in the chat as well.
And I'm not sure if you can see the chat, Rhodus, but we're getting a lot of people saying fact. Hashtag facts, fact.
Thank you for monitoring the chat. No, I'm unable to see the chat in this full presentation mode. So most of you feel that that statement is indeed a fact. And that is indeed a fact. What about the next statement? Will someone unmute and read the next statement for us? That way we get to lift your voice into the conversation as well. Will someone be brave enough, courageous enough to unmute and read the next statement for us?
Minority women as a whole experience unacceptably poor maternal health outcomes 3 to 4 times higher than white women, including disproportionately higher rates of death related to pregnancy or childbirth.
Thank you. And whose beautiful voice is that?
My name's Samantha from the Chatham County Public Health Department.
Thank you, Miss Samantha. Thank you. Thank you. So is that statement a myth or a fact as well? And please feel free to lift your response into the chat. Miss Jessica, what kind of responses are we receiving in the chat, my love?
We are getting a lot of people saying fact. So there's been at least about 30 people who have said fact.
Yes, and that statement is indeed fact as well, sadly. What about this next statement? That women who live in poverty, who are immigrants, who live with extreme stress, experience conflict, and have low social support, at higher risk of experiencing perinatal depression.
And again, unfortunately, we're getting a lot of facts. So
A lot of facts. So we're in with these last two statements, thinking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we know for our people of color, our community of color, that the COVID-19 pandemic really unsurfaced many of the inequities that exist at many different levels and in many different communities. So these last two statements remind us of that, of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our minority population. I do not like this term. Underserved, yes, underserved, I do commit to. Our minority population is in underserved communities. And this last statement, these last two statements echo that as well. Thinking about the overrepresentation of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the lack of access to healthcare as well. So sadly, all of these statements are indeed facts, and all of these statements actually echo many of the inequities that may exist in our healthcare systems. But all of us are fully aware that these inequities exist in other systems as well, in our educational systems, in our judicial systems as well. So home visiting and many of the various roles that you all play is actually viewed as an essential preventive social service model that really can interrupt many of these inequities, particularly through your personal practices and through your professional practices. And actually, the title of this article actually views home visiting during the pandemic as absolutely critical and as a lifeline to our children and to our families and to our communities. So we know that evidence-based home visiting models, they have potential to support and improve and enhance outcomes for children and families, even school readiness. And this Region 10 racial equity brief is actually referenced on your resource sheet, which I'll talk about near the end of our time together. Just want to take a look at the impact of home visiting. We know that home visiting has potentials to mediate or offset many of society's most pressing challenges, including child abuse, neglect, and this failure to succeed in school, although we know that there are many different factors that may be influencing a child's quote unquote failure to succeed in school. Most of you are working directly and engaging directly with children and families. So you are in this role where you are providing increasing disparate capacities, family capacity, broader than parent. Many of you already know you're working broader than just parent. You're enhancing this family capacity to support their well-being as well as the well-being of their children. And your efforts also reduce interactions in juvenile justice systems as well as social services systems. So this session, this conversation is about advancing racial equity. The context may be advancing racial equity in home visiting services, but all of these strategies that we will discuss apply to advancing racial equity in all of our systems and in all of our communities to support diverse children and families, particularly people of color and community of color. So before you, I have lifted one definition of racial equity. However, if I were to ask you to define racial equity, what would you say? What words would you use to define racial equity? And please feel free to lift your responses in the chat as well. And please do not worry about thinking incomplete sentences. Just share your immediate responses, your immediate phrases. What words would you use to define racial equity?
So I'm seeing in the chat, even playing field. Everyone has the same opportunity to succeed. Opportunity, acknowledgement of injustice.
Yes.
A lot of opportunity. I see equal opportunity. Meeting people's needs where they are. Non-judgmental.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So many of you, your words echoed the outcomes of when inequities do not exist. You're using words such as being non-judgmental. You're using words such as opportunities. You're using word as you want to see an equal playing field. All of that highlights the outcomes that we possibly may see when we engage in efforts to address inequities, when my race is not playing a role. And that is indeed the definition of racial equity. When my outcomes, my opportunities, my experiences are no longer inhibited or limited based solely on my race. So thank you for lifting your words that you would use to define racial equity, because your words are the catalyst and the power to address inequities. So hold on to your words. I love this quote. Will someone unmute and lift this quote into the space for us? And I'll get a swig. Will someone lift this quote into the space for us?
I'll do it. For us to advance racial equity, first and foremost, it is vital that we are able to talk about race. We have to both normalize conversations about race and operationalize strategies for advancing racial equity.
And whose beautiful voice was that?
Hi, it's Mevin.
Hey, Miss Mevin, how you doing?
Good. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Miss Mevin. Thank you. So, Miss Mevin lifted this quote in the space for us. What kind of reactions did this quote evoke in you? That in order for us to begin to advance racial equity, we first must be comfortable and able to talk about race. Is that always an easy process?
It's definitely not an easy process, and I think the biggest thing is just trying to create a space that's safe enough for us to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And whose beautiful voice is that?
This is Samantha again, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Miss Samantha. No sorries. Thank you, my love. Thank you. Yeah, it's not always a comfortable place to be. It's not always a comfortable conversation to enter. We all know that from our very own experiences, because all of us are engaging in these conversations at various levels with individuals, with our families, and even in our communities. We are engaging in these conversations. That's one thing that I'm very hopeful about, that change can result at some level. We know that engaging in conversations related to racial equity creates a lot of emotional dissonance or responses, as well as a lot of cognitive dissonance and responses as well. Let's think about these 4 levels of racism that we must address if we are indeed wanting to advance equity for people of color and in communities of color. So we all must pay attention to what is known as these 4 levels of racism. And most of this content is going to be very familiar for many of you, but yet it warrants revisiting these levels of racism again, because all of these levels are constantly influencing and interacting and impacting experiences and opportunities daily. So we start out thinking about this personal level of racism. This is my beliefs, my own biases, my prejudice, my own ideas, my own views of my power, my privilege, my superiority. Then we move down to this interpersonal level. This is these interactions between individuals. You most often see this, sadly, through the action of perhaps hate groups within the community, through mobilizations of hate groups. So it's how individuals are influencing their interaction. That's the interpersonal level. Then we know that racism also exists at the institutional level or the systemic level. You may see it as referred as institutional or systemic. And this is where you're looking at these discriminatory policies and practices that are creating these inequitable opportunities. And what it does, it creates these inequitable opportunities primarily for people of color, and it maintains and sustains this power and this advantage for individuals who may identify as white or European. Structural racism is the most embedded part of racism. And why do I say it like that? That structural racism is the most embedded form of racism. So what do I mean by that? That structural racism is embedded in our country.
It's almost like the air we breathe.
Is that Miss Susan?
No, that's
Who's
Mevin again.
Say it again. Who is it? It's Mevin.
Mevin, yeah.
Yeah, tell me more. It's like the air we breathe.
Well, it's everywhere. It's in everything. Like you take it in as you live. You breathe it into your body. There's just no escaping it.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful analogy. That structural racism is like the air we breathe. And it's like that because it is embedded, because it's part of our history, our culture. It's how these systems were intentionally designed to oppress others and to provide advantages for others. And sadly, most of the practices, most of our operations, our policies, our law, even our federal laws are all grounded in maintaining this oppression for some and advantages for others. I love your analogy about structural racism being like the air that we breathe, because you're right, it is everywhere. It is one of the most harmful forms of racism. So thinking about our engagement with families, I want to lift just a few questions that all of us should be considering, and not only considering, but seeking a way to explore, to assess, to audit, and to answer. So thinking about your own individual work with children, with family, what are those key questions to advance racial equity, particularly in home visiting service, is who's the home visiting workforce? What are their characteristics? What are the demographics? What are their characteristics? So in one study by the Region 10 Racial Equity Racial Equity Brief, they found out that in their region, and their region was in like Alaska, Idaho, Washington State, so in Oregon. So recognizing that our very own population may produce a different response to this question, but yet it's an important question to ask. Who's the workforce? Who's working with our children and our families? Particularly, who's working with diverse children and families and in our communities of color? So Region 10 found that most of their home visitors and supervisors most often identified as white or European, whereas their families were vastly and distinctly differently. Another question that they wanted to know was, what are some of these essential knowledge and skills that individuals engaging with families may need? They found that individuals who were working with their families, they were very confident and competent in their knowledge of child development, social emotion development. However, they were least confident in supporting families, so particularly diverse children and families. And that could be children with special needs and culturally and linguistically diverse children and families. So they had this essential child development knowledge, the social emotion development knowledge. However, they were least confident in supporting diverse children and families, culturally and linguistically diverse children and families. Another central question that was assessed as part of Region 10's racial equity research study was, does race or ethnicity matter in family engagement? And so that's a question I would like to pause and lift to you for response. So does race or ethnicity matter in family engagement? What are your thoughts? Does it matter?
So I see somebody's responded. It allows us to meet people where they are and creates understanding.
Beautiful.
Easier to connect, builds trust.
Tell me, with that individual mind, telling us more about how race and ethnicity may make it easier to connect.
That was me. Debbie is my name.
Hey, Miss Debbie.
Hey. There's been a lot of research, and I don't even think it takes research, but research has shown that when there's a similarity in ethnicity and culture, and it makes sense because there are so many things that we take for granted that are easier to take for granted, not completely, but when you are of a similar race or culture. And that makes it easier to form that connection because you don't have that divide across these assumptions that are wrong.
Beautiful, Miss Debbie. Thank you. Which is why we must answer that first question. Who's engaging with our families? What are their demographics? What are their characteristics? So yes, research. Look, I love the way you say we don't need research. It's called this cultural fit. And we know that there's a lot of cultural disconnect that occurs in our systems when families are searching for someone who remotely resembles or can be able to identify with them at some basic level, some form of commonality, be it race or ethnicity. So it has been proven that our families are more likely to engage when the individuals who are, I don't want to say serving them, who are supporting them, maybe similar to them, be it by racial identity or ethnic identity, as well as other socio-demographic characteristics. And that could be anything from marital status to socioeconomic status, but they're looking for this element of similarity, and it does enhance family engagement. So it's important for us to know who is doing this work, who is engaging with our families, and how are they being when engaging with diverse children and families. So let's pause for a moment and think about, what is an equity-driven practitioner? I know that I entitled this activity the equity-driven home visitor, but we can place it in that context. we can begin to think about, so if I were an equity-driven home visitor, what are some of the essential attitudes, knowledge, and skills that I may possess in order to advance racial equity? So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I want to come back and look at y'all for a second. And I'm going to actually ask a question. Oops. Did my stop sharing work?
It did.
Okay, good, good, good. So were y'all able to access this handout on the equity-driven home visitor? Were y'all able to access this handout ahead of time? If not, we just do it as a whole group. And feel free to respond in the chat. I recognize we are in this virtual space. So I want you to think for a few minutes. Think about essential attitudes. Think about essential disposition, essential ways of being. What are some of the essential attitudes, disposition, ways of being of an equity-driven individual? Let's make it an equity-driven individual, not necessarily a home visitor, but an equity-driven individual. So what are some essential attitudes that this individual must possess?
And some people are saying in the chat, open-minded, empathetic, culturally humble, non-judgmental.
Beautiful.
Good listener.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So those are some of the essential ways of being, of engaging with others. Think about knowledge for a second. What are some of the essential knowledge of an equity-driven individual? And look, I can look at the chat now because I stopped my screen share. So I can come to see y'all in the chat. So think about knowledge. What are some essential knowledge that we all must possess? Oh my God, yes, Miss Samantha, that the family is the expert on their children. Miss Nevin, we must have knowledge of the history of racism and oppression that exist in our systems. Understanding cultural differences, beautiful. The impact of adverse early childhood experiences, our ACEs. Beautiful. Let's move down to the skills level. So if I were an equity-driven individual, what are some of the essential skills that I must possess? So yeah, understanding systemic racism, this openness to learning. I heard someone say culture. I heard someone use that term that's equated to cultural humility earlier. So let's think about some of the essential skills: listening, active listening, patience, communication skills, not the HC jargon. I love that. Yeah, you said culturally humble. That's a form of cultural humility. Gratitude. Gratitude. I always try to operate from the space of grace. Gratitude. Resourceful. Appreciation. Must know about the community. Yes, Dr. Cynthia. Must know about the community in which you live and the resources. Ability to step back and let families take the lead. Yes, you must have these core facilitation skills and understanding the family's culture. So all of these essential attitudes, knowledge, and skills, Ms. Tamika, repair when the rupture occurs. Vulnerability. Repair when the rupture occurs. There's I always like to say racial equity work is healing work. There's a lot of healing There's a lot of harm that has been done, but yet there's a lot of healing that's potentially may occur as well. Ability to ask question and hear the reply. Thank you, Miss Emily. Thank you. So hold on to some of these essential knowledge and skills of an equity-driven individual, because all of these knowledge and skills are key. Encouraging families to ask for resources that they need to make ensuring that the resources are meaningful to the children and the family. Let you know when you need to step back and seek assistance when needed due to secondary trauma. And Ms. Katrina, I'm equally conscious of that in these conversations, that even for individuals to engage in these conversations, they may be trauma-inducing as well. Yes, Miss Emily, that's the empowering piece, supporting individuals to advocate for themselves. So many different essential knowledge and skills that are needed to advance racial equity. And all of these knowledge and skills are tied directly to my personal way of being. My personal way of being. And so one of these other essential knowledge that I must possess is the impact of my very own biases on diverse children and families, on people of color, and on community of color. And that's where I would love to transition our conversation to now. Thinking about strategies for uncovering the impact of my implicit biases on inhibiting equitable opportunities and experiences for children, families, and communities. Yes, Dr. Cynthia, this exposure to other culture, that is part of cultural humility. That is the best place I can learn about others, is by being with others and having that willingness and that openness to learn about others. All of those are essence and tenets of cultural humility, openness, willingness, the desire to learn about and be with others. So let's think about implicit biases and how implicit biases are also continuing to contribute to some of the inequities that we see for children, families, and communities. Thank you all for lifting your responses to the activity of an equity-driven individual and highlighting some of the essential attitudes, dispositions, ways of being, as well as knowledge and skills that may be necessary to advance racial equity.
I'm wondering if we can go back to something you were talking about a little earlier when we were talking about safe spaces to have conversations. And
yes,
and
we actually call them courageous spaces.
Yeah, I guess I think, we just have to be careful around sort of this white fragility. Like, these are hard conversations, but we have to be willing to go into that place where we're not comfortable. And I think if we tiptoe around this and are looking, I think our politics are all about this right now. Like, well, we can't read that book, or, we can't talk about that. I think we have to be willing to say, this is hard, but we're going to go in there and confront this.
Thank you so much. This was never again.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine. No, thank you so much for lifting that into the space. Yeah, I never guarantee safety, because it goes back to how some of these conversations may be trauma-inducing for individuals. So we always like to set and open the space for courageous conversation. So we try to create this brave space for individuals to enter at their own comfort level and willingness. I can't force an individual to engage in these conversations, because individuals may not be ready to. There's a readiness level here. There's a willingness level here that must be considered. So we try to create brave and courageous spaces. And we extend invitations. It's all by invitations. So thank you, Ms. Bevan, for that reminder that we always can't guarantee safety in conversations related to race and racism. The chat is critical race. Yeah, there's a lot of political conversations around critical race theory, particularly in our educational systems. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Yes. It takes a great deal of finesse to facilitate these conversations, because the last thing I want to do is offend anyone, because we need allies in this work. We need other champions in this work, because I can't do it alone. I can't dismantle racism by myself. I have to join with others in this work. So it's important for me to be very cautious and very careful of the language that I use, of the words that I use. And I always ask for grace in these conversations, because I'm not always going to say it correctly. I'm not always going to use the right words. So I always ask for grace. Is there room for grace? This work is about being human with each other. Beautiful. Thank you all for lifting your responses in the chat. That's why I wanted to pause. Miss Mevin, she brought us to the space where we needed to pause. And in this work, that is actually called an equity pause. Sometimes we need to step back from this work. It's called an equity pause. If you were to search the literature, equity pauses are important in this work, because this work is hard. This work is emotionally draining. So sometimes you have to take what is known as an equity pause, and that's just space for great reflection, space to become clearer on your goals, the why are you engaging in this work, and your next steps as well. Thank y'all. So let's engage in a few strategies for just becoming more aware of some of our own implicit biases that may be perpetuating inequities in our systems as well. We're all in different places. We're all in this work at different levels and different journeys. We're on our individual journeys, collective journey as well. Thank you, Ms. Cynthia. Thank you. There were great allies and champions in this work who identified as white or European. So we know that our implicit biases, our unconscious thoughts and actions and behaviors also have potential to influence inequities for people of color and community of color. We know that we are not aware that these biases even exist, because they reside in the unconscious part of our brain. So we are not aware of them. We know that there are differences between implicit biases and explicit biases. The major difference being implicit, we're totally unaware that these biases exist, Explicit, we are aware of our biases, and sadly, we may act upon them. And you may see those displays of explicit biases in terms of overt racism, as well as racist acts and racist comments. What's important to acknowledge when we're having conversations about biases that we all have biases. We have biases and preferences for our favorite food, our favorite people, our favorite thing to do. And we know that these biases form early in life. It may be part of cultural conditioning. It may be part of socialization. And some of these biases are just tacit. They're not even directly taught. They may be implied. They may be implied. That's the tacit socialization piece. We know that these biases are at play in all of our systems, including our educational systems. We see it in terms of how African-American males, particularly if they're tall, are seen as full-grown at the age of 13. We see that these biases have potential to influence increased interactions with our law officials and our judicial system, particularly for people of color. We see these biases play out in our healthcare systems. We see it in the unequal gender treatment, and we even see it in these increased disciplinary actions, suspension and expulsion rates for boys and for our girls of color as well, and for our girls who identify as queer. So these biases are at play, particularly implicit biases, in many different systems beyond education. So let's look at some strategies for disrupting and transforming implicit biases. I'm going to lift another video into the space by Procter & Gamble. Y'all, I love Procter & Gamble campaign to combat racism and their implicit bias videos. These are some powerful videos. So as you watch this video, I want you to take note of how are these biases developing. I'm going to try to play this in YouTube and see if I can get a larger screen. So let me know if y'all can hear it if I switch to YouTube.
Good morning. How are you? Cool.
So I think you need to share your screen again because we're hearing the YouTube video, but not seeing it at this time.
But not seeing it. So let's stop sharing.
You can also take the link for the YouTube video, and when you share, go to play an external video, and then you can pop the YouTube link in.
Okay. Learn me, honey. So, okay, come back. Did I start? Okay, go to share. Play an external video, pop the link in, and hit share again.
There you go.
Good morning.
All right.
How are you?
Thank you.
Cool. So, can we talk about how you got here?
You think I got a funny looking face?
Hey kids, I'm telling you right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it. I guess.
Well, looks broken.
Looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm gonna have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair. Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you? You just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop!
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
So, as you watch that video, how are biases forming? And how are biases being influenced? Feel free to lift your responses in the chat. So how are biases forming? And how are biases being influenced? What were some of the biases that were demonstrated in our hidden biases video?
So I'm still waiting for the biases to come in, but folks have said, you know, it's powerful, and so they're expressing their emotion first. Some of the biases are coming in. I see single mother being pulled out to be wrong or bad. When she corrected his expression, that was a bias. Someone wrote, biases formed through repeated experiences that indicated there's something wrong with us.
Miss Sylvia. You're echoing what I called earlier. Remember, I talked about tacit socialization, that nothing was said, nothing was spoken, but certain things were implied in that sandbox. Thank you, Miss Cynthia. There was a huge assumption that the family was abusing the child. Miss Trina, yes, yes. So just mere fact of being in a certain location. So this video had provided us an opportunity to step back and explore how individuals' implicit biases were manifesting in the life of this young man and his family. What about the classroom interaction over the book? What was occurring there in the classroom when he was a preschool child? What was occurring in the classroom interaction? Miss Ramona, how you doing? So there was some assumption. He was assumed to be the aggressor. Yes, someone else in another session also picked up on the expression of the other young child in that interaction when the boy of color was signaled out. So many different elements of individuals' implicit biases, as well as how their implicit biases were influencing and impacting the young child and his family. Thank you, Miss Alicia. Oh God, Miss Ramsey, how you pronounce your name? You know, having a name like Rhodus, I've learned not to butcher individuals' name.
It's pronounced Till-you.
Till-you. Beautiful. Thank you. I wasn't going to try that in my South Carolina dialect. I was not going to try that. Corrected his speech. I'm from the Gullah Nation, so I definitely have my own rapid speech and mode of speech. Thank you all for really taking time to process that video, our hidden biases. Let's think about another activity for beginning to uncover and lift our implicit biases, as well as explore and examine the potential impact of our implicit biases. So it does foster this us versus them rather than this we perspective that definitely is needed in order to advance racial equity, because racism has harmed all of us. Okay, Miss Jessica, I'm kind of tangled up on here. I don't know if I'm in share screen, video mode. I don't know where I am. What y'all seeing on y'all end?
We're currently seeing part of the YouTube video on the screen.
Okay. Can
And
I
now we're
close the
seeing
external? Can
Yes,
I close
now-
this?
Yes, we see you now.
Okay, good. Y'all, I'm learning this new system, honey. Lord Jesus. Let's see if we can find the PowerPoint again. We go from one thing to the next. Okay, there's my PowerPoint. We've done that. We looked at our hidden biases. Are you able to see the slide? I just want to check in.
Yes, we can see it.
Make sure. Okay, good. So So another strategy for becoming more aware of our implicit biases is slowing down. So let's lift this scenario into the space, and I'm going to invite you to share what is occurring. Will someone read the scenario for us? And it's entitled The Father-Son Activity.
A father and son were involved in a car accident in which the father was killed and the son was seriously injured. The father was pronounced dead at the scene of the accident, and his body was taken to a local morgue. The son was taken by ambulance to a nearby hospital and was immediately wheeled into an emergency operating room. A surgeon was called. Upon arrival and seeing the patient, the attending surgeon exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's my son. Can you explain this?"
Thank you. Now, whose voice is that? What's that?
Dr. Askew, Dr.
All
Cynthia.
right, Miss Cynthia. All right, Dr. Askew, I thank you.
You're welcome.
So, thank you, my love, my beautiful love. So what's occurring in the scenario? Please leave your responses in the chat. Who is the surgeon, and what is the surgeon's relationship to the young man? Immediate reaction. Miss Jessica, any responses thus far, my love?
So I'm seeing another father, the mother, the boy has a stepfather, mother and surgeon. My immediate reaction was the surgeon is the mother, but it could also be a same-sex couple. Assuming the surgeon is male, his mother.
Okay, beautiful. The surgeon is indeed the young man's mother. Let me share the rationale for the potential responses that we often receive to this scenario. So, and I'm going to read this. Usually I don't like to read in training and presentations, but I'm going to read this. So around 40% of participants who are faced with this challenge do not think of the most plausible answer, being the surgeon is the boy's mother. Rather, readers invent elaborate stories such as the boy was adopted and the surgeon was his natural father, or the father in the car was a priest. As such, the exercise illustrates the powerful pull of automatic stereotyped associations. For some individuals, the association between surgeon and men is so strong that it interferes with problem solving and making accurate judgments. So we have this automatic association of surgeons being primarily men that we may not even think about that the surgeon may indeed be a female, which highlights the impact of gender biases. So in our efforts to uncover our implicit biases, we must slow down before drawing conclusions, before making decisions, and particularly before acting on those decisions, because we see the consequence of individuals who act on their implicit biases, sadly, played out in our media almost daily. Another activity for uncovering implicit biases, well, another form of biases that is known as affinity bias. How many of you are familiar with affinity bias? I know you're probably saying, what in the world is affinity bias, Rhodus? How many of you are familiar with affinity bias?
Some people have said they heard the term but not sure of the meaning, or they're not familiar with the term.
Thank you, Miss Jessica. Thank you. Thank you all for lifting your responses. Thank you. So let's explore the impact of what is known as affinity bias. It is another form of unconscious bias as well. And this activity is entitled the circle of trust. Let me check my time to see if we're going to have time to play this video. Yeah, so Mr. Scott is going to explain what our trusted 10 is and what this trusted 10 may mean to exploring our affinity biases. Okay, Ms. Jessica, should I do it from the screen or let's do it through YouTube again?
Let's see. I think it looks good on the screen.
Okay, we'll do it through the PowerPoint then.
We're ready to dive into a conversation about a topic we're all really familiar with, and that's the topic of trust. I'll give you a worksheet in a minute, and it's folded for a reason because I'd like to invite you not to open up the worksheet. And down this left-hand column is a space for you to jot first names or initials of people that fit that category of people you trust. Think about who are the people that you would say you trust. And as much as possible, don't put family members. By looking around, most of you have your first column filled out. So let's move to part 2 of the activity. So if you open up the worksheet, you'll see across the top is a variety of diversity dimensions. So what I'd like to invite you to do is just go through the names of that first column and code them by their diversity. So if they're a male, put an M in gender. If they're a female, put F. And you'll get the hang of just coming up with your own code. And notice what you notice as you go through the process. I want to give you I don't know if you'd call it a model. It's kind of a way that we'd like you to think about this phenomenon of how people work their way into your trusted 10. So just kind of think of level 1 trust is folks that you are just getting to know or that you're acquainted with. This is always the biggest number of people we know. It's people we're familiar with. So over time, folks wind their way at work across, and it's a gradation, it's almost degrees, into this second level. If we use time and relationship building, then people move into, my really bad acronym is COMFY. And that's come over to my front yard. And that list of people, I would say, have moved beyond I know their name to their people that I would trust in my house and in my yard. Usually about 10% of this outer circle that we actually feel comfortable with. So the trust is growing there. Those people we trust more. And then we move into that, inner sanctum that we'll call trust. Maybe it's the trusted 10, maybe it's the trusted 20. This is the most diverse group of people in my life. For you too, right? This is it kind of thins out a little bit there. And then we move into our trusted 10. And for most of us, we see the least amount of diversity in that circle. When I have a chance to give somebody, I'll call it a sexy assignment. It's a high visibility project, access to senior leaders. Really, it's maybe a stretch assignment. Am I going to go to the people on my team at this level? Most people would say that they're going to be moving up into this zone or probably into this zone. And so the implication for us as an organization, right, is if we keep giving the good opportunities, promotions, stretch assignments to folks that are up in this zone, then what's going to probably happen with diversity on your team? We're going to keep replicating people that see the world more like we do. When you go back to your team, when you go back to being an amazing leader, what are some conscious things that you might do over the next weeks or days to take what you learned about the like-me bias and put it into practice? The more we're able to talk about the like-me bias and how it might be influencing our decision-making, the more we take this from the unconscious to the conscious.
So you heard Mr. Scott use that term, the like-me bias. And that is what affinity bias is. So we also shared with you this handout ahead of time as well. We may not have time to fully engage in this activity. However, I'm going to invite you to definitely spend some time exploring those individuals who you view as part of your circle of trust. So I talked briefly through how this activity would have proceeded. So ideally, we would have placed you all in groups, and you would have first have been provided an opportunity to identify 6 to 8. Mr. Scott says 10, but I usually limit it in our session to 6 to 8 individuals. You will write those individuals' initial on a piece of paper. This handout has been sent to you, so it is accessible to you. You will think about those 6 individuals. You will be encouraged not to include family members. And then, as Mr. Scott highlighted, you would use these identity dimension, is how I like to refer to them. And you're going to assign these individuals how aspects of their identity. So if I had my first initial was a J, I want to indicate how the individuals identify from a gender perspective, a racial perspective, ethnic perspective, the age, sexual orientation, the education level, ability status, marital status. The other category can include items such as language, religion as well. So after you've had an opportunity to assign aspects of that and those individuals' identity that you presume a part of your circle of trust, you take a broad stroke look at these individuals and you begin to answer these questions. Are individuals in my circle of trust just like me? Or are different individuals a part of my circle of trust also? What this activity allows us an opportunity to do is to identify where aspects of affinity bias are influencing my interactions and my relationships as well. So this handout has been shared with you in advance. So I would love for y'all to definitely spend some time exploring the circle of trust activity. Take it back and use it with your colleagues because it is a powerful activity that demonstrates that we most often tend to associate with individuals who are just like us. Hence the concept of affinity bias. So it is this prefaces to individuals who are just like us. However, we recognize that in order to advance racial equity, it requires us to associate and to be engaged with individuals who we may perceive to be different than us in many aspects of dimensions. So this affinity bias shows up in terms of the prefaces. We tend to treat, to respect, to trust those individuals we view as part of our circle of trust better than we treat individuals who we view as not part of our circle of trust. And it does lead to this favorable attention for some and unfavorable treatment and attention for others that we view differently than us. So definitely spend some time with this activity. It is accessible to you. I would spend some time with it individually, and I would engage with individuals that I interact with to see who indeed is part of my circle of trust. And is my circle of trust diverse? If it's not diverse, it may indicate that there may be need for expansion to engage with individuals who perhaps are not just like you, are not just like me. Any questions or comments about the circle of trust? And I do apologize that time did not allow us to really dive into this powerful activity. Any questions or comments about the circle of trust or affinity bias?
I'd like to say, this is Emily Ragland, that it seems interesting too how it changes. So as we get older, or if we look at our past circles, it has changed, and it's interesting to see what part of perhaps your identity changed as well. So when I look at mine, it's a lot of different people before I became more comfortable and confident in who I was and my identity, and now it's a very different group of people.
Oh, Miss Emily, that is a powerful comment. Oh my God, the conversations we can have around this. You're indicating how our social identity has the potential to change over time. And that's exactly what happens. Our social identity, that's the groups that we perceive ourselves as being a part of or belonging to. But that can change. I can lose my job today, hence my socioeconomic status is going to shift. That's part of my social identity. I could become divorced, hence being married was a part of my social identity. I'm now in a different group. I could become sick. I could be in a car accident. So my health status may shift. So aspects of our social identity may shift over time. So you stated that so eloquently and so beautifully. So thank you for lifting that. So definitely spend some time with the circle of trust. Definitely spend some time with the circle of trust. Another idea for uncovering implicit biases to advance racial equity is the concept of perspective taking. And this was echoed in the chat earlier, how we move from this us versus them to this me perspective. And that is indeed perspective taking. Perspective taking allowed us to really make efforts to live that proverbial phrase of placing ourselves in another person's shoe or walking in another person's shoe. Oftentimes, I like to lift this video into the space to highlight the power of perspective taking. So I think we get a little time to do this video right quick. I'm going to pause this video and I'm going to ask you what will happen next.
If you think you know what happens next.
So what will happen next? Please free to lift your responses in the chat. What is going to happen next?
So the responses are coming in, but it looks like people are first just expressing their thoughts on the video. It's a favorite video of many. Mebin says she thinks something unexpected. She hopes it's something unexpected. Another person wrote food delivery, feeding his family. I think he's door dashing. Another person wrote, sounds like police are coming. Someone called the cops on a black man for being black. Someone else says they have no idea. Another says assisting an ailing grandparent. They'll call the police. So there's a variety of answers coming in.
Beautiful. Thank you, Miss Jessica. Thank you all so much for lifting your responses in the chat. So let's see what really happens next.
Ask yourself why. These are the black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. picture of Black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
So, was your perspective different before I paused the video, and did your perspective shift after we saw what really happened next? So it's powerful video just to demonstrate how often we all may have the capacity to make decision based on very limited information about individuals, about situations, and about experiences that may provide insight into our very own implicit biases and their potential to impact children, families, community, and limit our efforts to advance racial equity. So you received this PowerPoint, and it had some strategies for becoming more aware of your implicit biases. That's just acronym, just pause. Pausing before making a decision. We had an opportunity to engage in pausing and slowing down when we did the father-son activity, asking yourself certain key questions before making assumptions, before making decisions. All of these will be in your PowerPoint as well. So moving toward advancing equity is going to require us to think about our own personal and professional practices, our organizational practices. So we shared with you a multicultural continuum. That's one of your handout as well. And that continuum allows you to reflect upon your personal practices, your professional practices, your organization culture, as well as your organizational policies and practices as well. The continuum ranges from an organization or an institution that perhaps may be at a 1 in terms of being exclusive, where they are intentionally creating and maintaining policies that exclude, or that should say exclude, I correct that before I give that, that intentionally excludes certain populations, and it also maintains the decision-making and the power dynamics within the organization. Your organization may be at a 2, where it's passive, where we have tolerance for people of color, of community of color, and we may even say we do not have a problem here. That's a very passive organization. Your organization may be in the stage of symbolic change, where you do see yourself as a non-racist organization, but yet there is little change in policy or the organizational culture. You may have some transformative change beginning at the level 4. You may be even engaging in training such as this, sponsoring training on anti-racism for your staff, but yet the culture of the organization still maintains oppression for some and advantages for others, also known as maintaining power for some and privilege for others. Then you may move down in this more transformative level at level 5 and 6, where there are indeed structural changes. And you are definitely making efforts to assess your practices, your policies, and you're intentionally inviting individuals of color in the decision-making process as well. And then our goal, our hope is for organizations to transform to this fully inclusive anti-racist organization where there is shared power amongst diverse racial, ethnic, and economic groups. The continuum is easy to explain in such a linear fashion. However, I must pause and recognize that all of this requires great effort and time and willingness. So definitely spend some time with the Anti-Racist Multicultural Organization Continuum. It's one of your handout as well. Your PowerPoint and the resource handout is full of a plethora of additional resources for you to continue exploring this content further. There's even a self-assessment in here. It's called the Toolkit for Home Visitor and this Strengthening Family Self-Assessment Tool. But we know that these strategies apply regardless of our roles of engaging with children and families. You have implicit biases resources to explore further in your PowerPoint as well. And we will not play this last video in the interest of time, but this video just really reminds us that the labels we assign to others, the labels we carry ourselves, have great potential to impact how we view ourselves and how we view others. And I want to close our conversation by reminding us about that powerful quote that was lifted earlier. And that quote said that in order for us to advance racial equity, we must become comfortable talking about race. So thank you for lifting your voices, your experiences, your stories into the space and into the conversations today as we all continue to make efforts to advance equity for people of color, for community of color, and for ourselves.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I am watching the chat right now, and there are many great words being spoken about you. Everyone thinks you're an amazing facilitator. So just want to give you kudos for presenting.
Oh, thank y'all.
It is. They're very positive. So thank you so much. I'm going to pop a survey link in the chat for anyone who would like to provide feedback on this session. Additionally, you can find these resources on the agenda page and for the description of the session on the agenda or in your virtual portal. So thank you so much. There's a lot of good resources shared. Please provide your feedback. Our next session will begin at 3 o'clock. So thank you all so much for joining the Home Visiting and Parenting Education Summit, and thank you for presenting.
And stay in touch. I put my email in the chat. So many of you already have my email and know how to get up with me. So definitely stay in touch, and we can continue these conversations further. And we can explore these resources together as well. So definitely stay in touch.
All right, I'm going to close out this session, but again, thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please email special events at smartstar.org, and I can help you out or point you in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much.